Now let us pray. Gracious, loving God, may the words of my mouth, the meditation of our hearts, and the work of our hands be acceptable to you. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and sound judgment. These words addressed to Timothy, a young pastor who for 4 years had been ministering to the church at Ephesus, were written by or attributed to the Apostle Paul. These are one of 2 pastoral letters to Timothy. But before we start focusing on the words, I'd like to take a second and thought about the images. Try to picture in your minds, to visualize the scene. Think of Paul writing this letter in a damp, dismal Roman prison, or of the courier bringing the letter to Timothy and those living in Ephesus during the 1st century. Paul's second letter to Timothy was composed, we believe, about 64-65 AD. It would probably have been written on papyrus, rolled in a script, and taken by a courier. In those days, they didn't trust the Roman or didn't use the Roman State Postal Service. You would find a trusted companion, Paul would have, to bring the letter to Timothy in Ephesus. Now, from Rome, where Paul was writing, the courier would have traveled the Via Appia, or the Appian Way, a durable road made of tightly fitted stone, much of which is still visible today in Italy. He would have gone about 350 to 365 miles south to the port of Brindisi on the Adriatic Sea. When the courier reached Brindisi, he would have seen a triumphal arch built to celebrate the completion of the Via Appia under the Emperor Trajan. The arch is still there. Then he would have boarded a small or medium wooden sailing vessel with probably one big sail and gone off by sea to the port of Ephesus, which was in those days one of the most important cities in the Roman province of Asia, which is now in what we call Turkey. Known as the gateway to Asia, the 1st century Ephesus was a prosperous metropolis of over 200,000 people. It was also known as the city of Artemis, the Greek earth goddess, the goddess of the hunt, of wilderness, of animals, the moon, and chastity. She was the daughter of Zeus, and she is portrayed as a fierce, independent maiden with a bow and a quiver, a protector of young girls and nature. On his way to Timothy's church in Ephesus, the church is no longer visible. Among the preserved and often ruins of this city, some of you have visited Ephesus. It is wonderful to see how well preserved these ruins are. The courier carrying Paul's letter would have passed this temple of Artemis. Artemis was rebuilt by the people of Ephesus in their own money after the death of Alexander the Great. It was the 3rd temple on that site, the 2nd temple, and was the 2nd of the 3rd temple. It was huge. Picture 450 feet long, 69 feet wide, 60 feet high, with more than 127 columns. Sources describe the temple adorned by paintings and columns gilded with gold and silver, and religious works by renowned Greek sculptors. The people of Ephesus, worshiping at the temple's altar, as they did frequently, also held an annual festival to Artemis. So the courier bearing Paul's letter to Timothy could not have known, of course, that this pagan festival would be the fate which befell then Bishop Timothy at Ephesus in around 897 AD. While protesting at this festival of the goddess Artemis, he was set upon by a pagan mob, which beat Timothy and stoned him to death, some 32 years after Apostle Paul, then of course under arrest in Rome, was beheaded. Paul was a Roman citizen, and because he was a Roman citizen, he was able to get the execution done, not by crucifixion, but because he was a citizen, he could be beheaded. The second letter to Timothy may be one of Paul's last letters, written from this prison in Rome, where he awaited this execution. Although a Roman citizen, Paul was arrested in 65 AD after being falsely accused of being a ringleader of some sect, an illegal sect called the Nazarenes. And he was seen to be a troublemaker and a seditious influence. Now, to me, Paul's letters do not read as if they were written by Timothy's boss or his supervisor, or some first century version of our Methodist district superintendent. Paul rather addresses the letter to Timothy, my dear son. And he goes on to write, I remember you always in my prayers day and night. As one commentator explained, the entire letter consists largely of personal advice to Timothy as a younger colleague and assistant. Now, I've been thinking about the word advice, and to me, it doesn't immediately conjure up some serious theological or spiritual thoughts. Rather, to me, at my age, it brings back memories about columns like Dear Miss Manners or Dear Abby. Remember those? Those seeking advice often ask frivolous questions. As one man asked Miss Manners, should I dust off my fedora to fly economy class? Another asked of Miss Manners, we hated our friend's cabin, but if they ask us if we had a good time, how do we respond? We don't want to hurt them. To which Miss Manners wisely replied, say you were so kind to let us use your cabin. The area is beautiful, and we're so happy to get away. But then she said, don't add, to get away from your house as soon as possible. Many people, of course, who wrote Dear Abby or Miss Manners had serious concerns about marriage, about their work, about their careers, about broken relationships. And we know that a word of advice may offer a lot of valuable information and guidance. It can be a recommendation for a better course of action or a warning about possible danger or trouble ahead. However, while often well-intentioned, advice also has its disadvantages. I learned that relying on advice can prevent individuals from exercising their own judgment. They never think about it, they just ask for something, some kind of advice. Or advice can also be given from very biased perspectives. Unsolicited advice can be interpreted as condescending or judgmental. I want you to think this week, when you have a few minutes, about the one piece of helpful advice you've been given, and the one, unwelcome one or detrimental one. We don't know how Timothy reacted to Paul's advice. This is very unclear. Was he grateful? Was he encouraged? Or was he disencouraged? When Paul wrote, and I quote, there will be difficult times in the last days. People will be selfish, greedy, boastful, and conceited. Rather than support, was Paul's reminding Timothy to, quote, to keep alive the gift that God gave you, a form of judgment, like maybe he hadn't been? We don't know if Timothy actually asked Paul for advice. I was not able to find any record that there were letters from Timothy to Paul, which there may have been, but we have them. But if he shared his anxieties and concerns in his role about a pastor at Ephesus, we don't know. He may well have. We do know, however, that Paul met Timothy, that he was the son of a Jewish mother named Eunice and a Greek father, and they met in the town of Lystra. Paul then added Timothy to the group. He was probably, at this time, Timothy was probably a mid to late teenager. They decided to go ministering together on Paul's journeys, and Paul began to look out for him, to mentor Timothy. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 16, if Timothy comes your way, be sure to make him feel welcome among you, because he is working for the Lord just as I am. Over the years, when you study about this particular relationship, you realize how close a relationship Timothy and Paul had. And in Philippians 2, if it is the Lord's will, Paul writes, I hope that I will be able to send Timothy to you soon. He is the only one who shares my own feelings and cares about you. Everyone else is concerned only with their own affairs and not with the cause of Jesus Christ. In his second letter to Timothy, Paul tells Timothy about what he feels is the most important, and that is to be faithful to his calling as a pastor. In verse 8, Paul writes, do not be ashamed of me, of witnessing for our Lord, neither be ashamed of me, a prisoner for Christ's sake. Instead, take your part in suffering for the good news as God gives you strength for it. Timothy is advised and encouraged to keep on witnessing faithfully to Jesus Christ and hold to the true teaching of the good news, to do his duty as a teacher and an evangelist, all in the face of suffering and opposition, to keep on keeping on. Now, for those living in the Roman Empire in the first century, witnessing for the Lord could be indeed difficult, even risky, as I spoke a minute ago, what happened eventually to Timothy. Although the Pax Romana offered the Roman elite a golden age, stability, a uniform code of law, unified currency, and safe trade routes which enabled economic prosperity, even in cities where there were freedmen or ex-slaves. But there were disadvantages. Disadvantages I learned living in cramped, dangerous apartment blocks in the cities. There was a high infant mortality rate, a short life expectancy, and an economy which relied heavily on slaves. I was quite surprised to learn that in the first century of the Roman Empire, in Italy, 40% of the population were enslaved. 40%. Furthermore, the first century was marked by political instability as new rulers came to power through coups, inflicting tax burdens on some while presenting others with extreme inequality, dangers, and harsh conditions for the majority, especially for Christians. Despite the growing popularity of Christianity, it was misunderstood, and membership could bring serious risks and consequences. Now, these risks increased dramatically, as some of you may know, under the Emperor Nero, the popular Roman leader who legend claimed, remember this one, fiddled while Rome burned? I was surprised to learn that Nero wasn't even in Rome during the Great Fire. He was in Antium, 35 miles away, and he could not have fiddled because the fiddle was not invented until the 11th century. That's what I love about history. You gotta piece it a little better. Nero was, however, wildly criticized after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. And as leaders and emperors, presidents, prime ministers, and others have done since and are now doing in many places, to divert attention away from his own failings, Nero shifted the blame onto the Christian community. He accused them of being arsonists, of starting this fire, which was not true. Christians were already regarded with suspicion, as some of their rituals were mistaken for cannibalism or incest. And Nero seized the moment. He wasted no time arresting and executing Christians in Rome, a great many of them. Although Nero's persecutions were not repeated in other parts of the empire, Christians could be punished if they publicly stood up, they criticized Rome, or refused to abandon their beliefs. Thus, Christians in Ephesus had every reason to be fearful, prompting Paul to write to Timothy, "For God has given us not the spirit of fear, but the spirit of power, love, and sound judgment." We all have fears, don't we? We all have fears, Desmond Tutu explained. Fear and anxiety are mechanisms, he wrote, that help us survive. You know, he wrote, if you did not fear when you saw a lion over there and walked merrily by, in next to no time, there would be no you. And when asked how he managed fear during the dark days of apartheid, when Tutu received frequent death threats, he wrote, well, one did not do silly things like stand in front of a lit window at night, but one had to say to God, if I'm doing your work, you jolly well better protect me. I love Tutu. In South African activist Nelson Mandela's book Notes to the Future, he writes about fear. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but triumph over it. I felt fear more times than I can remember, but hid it behind a mask of boldness. The brave man is not he who feels afraid, but he who conquers that fear. In a book, How We Learn to Be Brave, Bishop Marianne Edgar Budd writes that what she keeps coming back to as a source of hope and strength are the historical accounts of men and women who faced challenges, the challenges of their times, with grit and grace. On this morning, the morning of United Women in Faith Sunday, when we read Paul's words to Timothy, I remember the sincere faith you had, the kind of faith that your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice had. Let us remember that, like Timothy, we too walk in the path of those who came before us. Whether we're connected by blood or faith, they are with us in tangible ways. We have an ancestral heritage that is not merely nostalgic, a heritage that may go back generations as we recall how our ancestors walked out their faith. They were not necessarily perfect, but God was with them. This morning, I thought it was especially appropriate to remember and honor United Methodist women who had been faithful, who were fearless, and who persevered. There's a long list, I can't mention them all, but women like Mary Fletcher, who defended women preachers at a time when women weren't supposed to be preachers. Abolitionists like Sojourner Truth. Civil rights activists like Mary Bethune and Teresa Hoover. Frances Willard, who fought for women's suffrage and other issues. And many early missionaries, doctors like Clara Swain, Isabella Thoburn, Bishop Leontine Kelly, all of whom broke barriers in preaching social justice and global mission, challenging norms and expanding opportunities for women in faith. I was most struck by one of them that I wanted to tell you about this morning. Teresa Hoover. She was born in Arkansas in 1925, one of 5 children, in a state where segregation was firmly entrenched. Teresa represented those who were in triple jeopardy: female, African American, and Christian. Her mother died when she was young, and her father, James Hoover, who was a city hospital orderly, was the one who taught her to be fearless and gave her the confidence to do what she needed to do. She graduated from college, from Philander Smith College in 1946, and helped the Little Rock Methodist Coalition of 19 black and white Methodist churches convert a turkey farm into a camp dedicated to African American youth. Possessed with an active prayer life and a deep grounding in the faith and history of Methodism, Hoover was not afraid to speak truth to power, but also did it, I read, with grace and respect. She led the church in difficult and changing times with grace and wisdom, mentoring many young women and promoting the leadership of lay women and ministering to women struggling with issues such as physical and sexual abuse. In 1948, she joined the Women's Division of Christian Service as a field worker for the denomination in the central jurisdiction. Traveling across the U.S. in Jim Crow days as an African American woman, working on racial justice issues meant, as a co-worker remembered, that she had a job that required sacrifices that none of the other women had to even think about. 20 years later, Hoover was elected to lead the women's division of the Board of Global Ministries, which she served for the next 22 years. She was remembered as having a presence that could be larger than life, but also soft and gentle as a dove. When she died, in her honor, the Women's Division created the annual Teresa Hoover Community Service and Global Citizenship Award, which is still given to a laywoman who wishes to study outside her own country or region. Women like Teresa Hoover exemplify, I believe, what the Apostle Paul advised Timothy, that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and sound judgment. Paul's words of wisdom and encouragement offer the same to us today. For these are what many of us feel are very troubling, confusing, difficult times. God has called us and equipped us to persevere in our faith. His love empowers us to be courageous, to use our gifts and graces and resources wisely, sound judgment, to speak truth to power, to stand up to false prophets, and to generously support efforts for peace and justice. And God gives us the spirit of love, to speak out not in anger, but from our faith in a Jesus who talked of the last being first, of becoming a servant of all, of laying down one's life for one's friends. A Jesus who affirmed the priceless value of denying oneself, of healing the hurting, caring for the poor, welcoming the stranger, of seeing and elevating the marginalized, of freeing the oppressed, and of being peacemakers. Let it be so.